I've done this all 3 times as a CEO, but even before that, as president of international and other roles I've had. I think it's very important to understand what is really happening in the company and not to have predetermined or preconceived notions and then coming out with a playbook saying, hey, you know how to fix it all. The answers to most problems in companies actually are already with your employees. You just have to listen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Future of Work. My guest today is Ravi Saligram, the president and CEO of Newell Brands. Ravi, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jacob. A pleasure and an honor.
I've been working on saying the name the right way because my family's Russian, so we're very big on like the R's, the R. So hopefully I said it okay.
You said it brilliantly. Thank you.
So to get started, because we have a lot of fun things to talk about today, why don't we start with a little bit of background information about you and your story, where you grew up, and how you ultimately became the CEO of the company that you're leading now.
Great. Do you want me to just
Yes.
get started on that and give you some... Right, I'll give you the elevator speech, if you will. So I was born in New Delhi, India, but raised in Bangalore. And before Bangalore became sort of high-tech capital of India, and so did my engineering there. And so I actually aspired, like you, to become a writer. And at about age 14, I wrote this book called Why Be a Sucker? And it was set in America that I'd never seen, but I was inspired by others. And so wrote this and sent it to all these. My boyhood hero was an author called James Hadley Chase, better known in Commonwealth countries rather than the US. He wrote all these crime novels, so I was inspired by him. And regrettably, I sent it to his publisher, who rejected it, and then it made the rounds and kept getting rejected. So I wrote to Robert Hale and said, please tell me the truth. And why are you rejecting this? And they said, well, number one, it's poorly written. Number two, it's only 156 pages. Try harder next time. So I sent off that novel to James Hadley Chase, but he very kindly wrote to me and said H.G. Wells had his first 15 books rejected and so on. But I decided maybe my life had to be something other than writing, and so I got into engineering and then came to America and went to business school here. And my first job was at Leo Burnett in advertising, and which was probably the most, it's influenced me in terms of my passion for consumers. Mm-hmm. And I can boldly state that in my tenure there, I had a little part, well, maybe more than a little part, of saving the Keebler Elves. So that's a story for some other time, but if you want to, we can chat about it later.
Yeah.
And then went to SC Johnson and spent 11 years there. And then went to Korea. As part of SC Johnson, was in Korea as the general manager of SC Johnson Korea. Very defining assignment for me, which I think really laid the foundation where I ended up becoming a CEO. But that was a great assignment. Then I've been with hotels. I've been with 7 companies. 3 times public company CEO of Office Max, Ritchie Brothers, and now Newell Brands. Lived in 6 countries, so that's had a big impact on my life. And I must say that the most influential people in my life are what I call my 3G network, my 3 girls, my wife, and my 2 daughters, who have committed to making sure that Ravi Saligram becomes the most humble person by consistently making sure that my ego keeps reducing.
All right. We're definitely going to talk about that, but a couple things first that I'm very interested in. So first, I find it interesting that because that book got rejected, that's kind of what put you on your current path. But had that book been accepted, your career path would have probably taken a very different trajectory, which I find interesting. So sometimes and I think this is important for a lot of people listening and watching to remember that sometimes when a door closes, another door opens, which is pretty much what happened in your case.
Indeed. Well, I think, look, I still want to write a book someday, and but you're absolutely right. And that's the other thing. It's interesting when I did my engineering, but I really hated engineering. I had to be good at it, and I was in the top, 1% of the university and all that. Only because in India with 1 billion people, you didn't have a choice. So. But it was interesting. I didn't get into the IIT, the most prestigious sort of Indian Institute of Technology, and so I was devastated at that time. But my grandfather told me, "Boy, don't be frustrated and be sad. Apply to business schools in America. That is where your future lies." And look, that to me was a door opened, and I've never looked back. So America is really, for me, it has been that American dream that has come true.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people who are watching or listening are going to be very angry with me if I don't ask you about the Keebler Elves story. So I feel like I have to ask you about the Keebler Elves story.
Great. So, yeah, I was account executive at Leo Burnett on Keebler crackers and new products. And, it's interesting because Keebler's biggest competitor at that time was Nabisco. And each of the brand managers wanted their own individual campaigns, whether it was for Townhouse crackers. So with my account supervisor, Jacques Chevron, wrote this seminal paper about why an umbrella marketing campaign using the Keebler Elves to talk about the hollow tree and the goodness and all that was so important for them. And so we went and presented this whole thing because they wanted individual brand campaigns. So I was doing all this presentation. I remember their chief marketing officer was so frustrated with this. He sort of, I think, walked out halfway through it and said no. And they were going to get ready to fire us. But fortunately, fate intervened. And I think both PepsiCo and P&G launched soft batch cookies. And so we went back and said, look, your biggest weapon to fight these competitors is the Keebler Elves. And so that's how the elves got saved. So,
Oh, man.
and so, yeah, it's a fun story.
Well, I'm sure many people who enjoy their cookies are thanking you right now for saving the elves. So I want to
Hey, the hollow
transition.
tree is very important.
Yes, yes, yes. So let's transition a little bit to your time at Newell Brands. So tell me about when you first started working there. What was the company like? What was the culture like when you first took over?
So this was 2 years ago. I celebrate my second year anniversary on October 2nd. And it has been a amazing journey. And when I started, clearly we were in the throes of starting a turnaround. And uh, uh, it was really the company, because of a merger, Newell Rubbermaid, as the company was called then, bought Jarden. And so with that came a lot of complexity. And so there was a fair number of integration issues. And so some companies had to be sold off and so on. So when I came in, there was definitely there was some employee churn and turmoil because clearly whenever you've had acquisitions and do two cultures come together, when there are different cultures, it's not the easiest thing. So I felt my job was to really stabilize the company, really get employees galvanized, and show them, get them aligned on a new purpose, and really stabilize the company for better returns. So it was really, we had my CFO Chris Peterson, who had come 6 months ago, had laid out a turnaround plan. I looked at it. I thought it was great. I said, let's go. So we've been doing that. I think there was one of the big issues for us was a lot of complexity. We had like 110,000 SKUs, 49 ERP systems, thousands of legal entities, thousands of apps, 400 websites. So it was just very complex. And we were not easy for customers to do business with. So we've just been chipping away at it and really getting the company to a much better shape. We today have more like we've brought it down to 47,000 SKUs. We think we'll get it down to 30,000 by 2022. We now have two ERP systems for 90% of our sales. So we've
Wow.
reduced, I think, 85% of the apps. So you name it, the teams have really gone about it. But I think the one thing is, I think a lot of it has been really getting a culture which is focusing on the people,
Yeah.
looking at people as our solution, not our problem, and galvanizing them to help solve these problems and pointing them and aligning them. And I think that has been very exciting for us as we've done that. And the last 12 months have been terrific. Even though COVID has really been such a catastrophe, our teams were able to leverage some of the trends that came about. Home as hub and outdoors. All of this, our teams have said, hey, how can we launch innovations? And we've capitalized on that. And in the 12 months, the first half, second half of last year, we grew sales, our organic sales, 6%. And in the first half of this year, it's been 23%. This is
Wow.
tremendous for a company that declined for 4 years before.
Yeah.
And this first half of this year, our operating profits have grown substantially higher than even the 23% sales. So it's credit to our leadership and our people.
I forgot to ask. People might be familiar with a lot of your products, but some people watching and listening might not know the name Newell Brands. So can you give us a little bit of context around the company? How many employees do you guys have? What are some of the products that I'm sure are sitting in everybody's homes watching and listening?
Yeah, absolutely, Jacob, with pleasure. And I feel passionately about our people and our brands. We have some incredible, iconic brands, things like Sharpie S Gel, Sharpie, which is well known in highlighters, markers, but now in pens as well. Marmot, ball jars, Coleman, Rubbermaid. So you name it, Calphalon. We're in different segments. First Alert in our homes, keeping us safe. So I think we've got 25 brands that are very iconic. We find our brands are number one or number two, and with very high penetration in American households. We're a global company, about a third of about 3 billion or so of our sales. We're about a $10 billion company. Little over 3 billion is outside the United States. And and we have 30,000 employees, about 18,000 in our factories and DCs. They are really our frontline heroes. Because of them, we've been able to really be viable and move forward. Because without their dedication and support during this pandemic, the rest would have been shadows.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful to our frontline heroes.
Yeah. So I want to touch on something that you said earlier. You've been at the company now around 2 years. You said October 2nd would be your 2-year anniversary. That's actually my mom's birthday. Very funny.
Oh,
Um,
great.
yeah. But I'm very curious because a lot of people who listen to this podcast, they might be new leaders, just taking over a team or an organization or a function. What did you do when you first took over as CEO? Your first couple of weeks in that role, did you just go in there and try to make change happen, or did you spend the first few weeks just talking to people? What was your first, I don't know, 30 days or so like?
Yeah, Jacob, that's a great question. For me, and I've done this all three times as a CEO, but even before that, as president of international and other roles I've had, I think it's very important to understand what is really happening in the company and not to have predetermined or preconceived notions and then coming out with a playbook saying, hey, you know how to fix it all. The answers to most problems in companies actually are already with your employees. You just have to listen. So I'm very strong believer in doing a listening tour. So even at Newell, I did a 100-day listening tour. I did that
Wow.
at Ritchie Brothers, at Office Max. And what I do is I talk to employees up and down the company. And I meet them individually. I meet them in groups. I meet them in different geographies just to listen and say, hey, what's going well? What's not going so well? If you were me and you had the position, power, what would you change in the company? And it's interesting how much you get. And I take down the notes and then look for patterns and look for themes, and that helps a lot. But then I also talk to customers. I go meet the top customers. I look at consumer research and say, what are consumers saying? I look at social media. Then I look at things like, what do employees who left? I went, before I joined, I looked at and read 500 uh, opinions on Glassdoor of people who had left, and sort of listened to what they had to say about the company and where the issues might lie. So when you do this, you understand across all your stakeholders. And I, of course, talk to shareholders and say, hey, what is bothering you? What are we doing well? What could we do better? When you listen to all of these inputs, that then gives you a plan. So even though we had a turnaround plan, I needed to do the listening tour to validate, is this the right direction? And I felt it was. But I also felt what needed most was to uplift our people, to really give them hope, to give them a direction, give them a noble purpose, and say, what are we all about? Because I think you want to bring out the best in your people.
Yep.
And the power of what I would say is, if you have 10 employees, you want 1 plus 1 plus 1 not to equal 10, but to equal 100. How do you take 30,000 employees and make the power exponentially rise to 300,000, so that is what I think leaders have to really bring out. It's not about their being the best. It is about bringing out the best in their people
Yeah.
and taking up to an exponential basis.
I love this idea of the listening tour. Do you have like a specific set of questions? You mentioned some of them. I think you said what's working, what's not working. If you were in my position, what would you fix? Were there any other specific questions that you were asking as you were going about your listening tour?
Yeah, I try to find out how long they've been in the company, and because that gives me a sense, and then I also try to find out where they were before and why they came. I also ask them sometimes, hey, given all the stuff that you told me, which may not have been the most negative or may have not have been the most positive, why are you still at the company? What's keeping you? So one of the things that was very interesting when I did my listening tour at Newell was people said, I'm here because of my teammates. Or supervisors
Interesting.
said, I want to make sure that our employees are taken care of. That's very noble. When you hear things like that, it stirs the
Yeah.
heart. And today, what I'm finding is in 2 years, the morale of our people has gone up dramatically. The engagement level of our people has gone up dramatically. They feel that there is a strong sense of vision, there's a strong sense of purpose. They feel that they can actually talk in there and be authentic. It's interesting how many questions or letters I get from employees, or I've got over the 2 years. Many times they write to me and say, Ravi, I need to tell you about so and so and so, this stuff. But they say, can you please keep it confidential? And they look at me, which is so interesting that they take the CEO. And I take that as a supreme compliment, because for
Yeah.
me, the fact that they trust me, and I try to reply every employee. I don't use others to reply my notes. I reply them just the same way when consumers complain. I always reply the consumers, other than maybe occasionally when it seems like that there is some legal issue or so. But 9 out of 10 consumers, I reply them because they never expect a CEO to
Yeah.
reply, and never himself. And immediately that diffuses so much of the angst.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think who's it? Doesn't Jeff Bezos from Amazon? He's famous, I think, for responding to some of his emails. Elon Musk, I think he responds to a lot of tweets that are out there. So I love it. I mean, I think it's great when the CEO of an organization, when somebody reaches out to them, when they respond back. I'm curious about a couple of
I
things,
think
though.
it is just a small matter. It shows you care, and
Yeah,
it has to be genuine. And you don't want to do boilerplate stuff. You just want to answer, and you want to make every employee feel special, because they are.
yeah,
And so I really believe in this concept of servant leadership, that my job is about serving my people, not the other way around. It's about the inverted pyramid.
Yeah. I know one of the things that I read a lot about you, and there were a couple of articles that were written, is that you have a no jerks policy. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. So, first, what is that policy, and how do you actually enforce it inside of your organization?
Yeah, I think it's probably the reality is it's probably more a philosophy than sort of a written policy, and but I think it is more about. Okay, this came way back when I was telling you about Leo Burnett and my good friend Bruce Grieve. He was the account executive on Keebler Cookies, and in the advertising business, you have all sorts of emotional types, right? And
Yeah.
it's a very colorful business, and so for us, it was important. He and I talked about, hey, we want to create a world where we called it good guys and good gals finish first as opposed to finish last. And that is sort of for me, we never expanded the club beyond us, but over time, I think it definitely influenced our leadership styles. And for me, that's really important. Like I have, over time, because there was a time when I was probably cocky and arrogant and stuff, but over time I've learned. And I think living overseas in Korea, when I didn't speak the language, I learned a little bit. But you learn about human communication and that good always prevails over being nasty. When you're nice to people and you appeal to their hearts, you're able to get a lot more mileage out of
Yeah.
them. So, and over time, as I've got older, I really feel it's important that people want to work with people that they like and that they respect, and because we spend so much time at work. So those relationships are very important. And when you look at attrition and people leaving companies, usually they leave the boss rather than the company.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think it's real important, whether you're a manager, a supervisor, or an executive, that we're constantly reinforcing this message. And to me, the no jerks, no aids policy or philosophy is just to telegraph, be compassionate, care for your people, don't be a jerk, don't write nasty emails. And it's not like I've not done that in the past. When I was much younger, yeah, I would send these really tough emails. Over time, I have really learned that you've got to be so careful about, because when someone who receives a tough email, what is their reaction to it? How do they feel? Did you ruin their day? So I think that is what I'm trying to create, a culture where that you don't have people who are consistent jerks and AHs. Look, everyone will have a bad day. Everyone will occasionally have a little meltdown. That's understandable. But what you don't want is consistently people being nasty to others.
Yeah.
We want good people, and good people can finish first. And now more than ever, I'm a very strong believer of that.
Yeah, it seems like kindness, compassion is the simple way to explain that. But I'm actually very curious. What happens if you work with or you see somebody at your organization who is a jerk? You know, they're doing all these things that you said that you don't want to do. What action do you take, if any, first as a leader? And second of all, what if you are working for a leader who's a jerk? Any advice for what employees should do in that situation?
Sure. I think, look, first, with people that I work closely with, and not just here, but in all my career, it's what we've done. What I do is coach them first, because I think it's very important to give constructive feedback. And then you do things like 360s. 360s have helped me so much to be a better leader, because you need a mirror put to your face to say, what do others think? So it's the 360. I'm a huge believer in that tool. And I think I had my first one. This wonderful HR lady called Gail Costomer in S.E. Johnson did it for me. And it was 5 pages. She talked to 21 people who worked with me. At
Wow.
age 31 to get that, I had 3 pages, 3.5 pages of great stuff, and then 1.5 pages of a lot of stuff that I had to improve. When I looked at it, I was shocked. And I was so depressed for a few days, saying, I can't believe people said all that about
What did
me.
they say?
But oh, they were like, oh, because sometimes I joke and they would mistake that to be being cocky or being arrogant.
Uh,
And I was full of myself. And partially some of that was true. That really changed me. And then going to Korea, where I didn't speak the language and I had to lead a company, that changed me so much more. But I think that is so important. I've done this. I've done 360s. I did it at Office Max when I became CEO. And then I present my results to my team and say, look, this is what you said, good, but also not so good. And here's what I'm going to improve. I did that at Ritchie Brothers. I think it's so important to do that. But then, look, at some point, if the values of this person, whoever it is, no matter how good they are, they could walk on water, but if they don't have the values that you are espousing, in our company at Newell, we talk about truth, transparency, teamwork. And for me, that teamwork is so critical. I am very big on people who are all about the company as a whole and their team as a whole, and not about just themselves. If they're all about themselves, I get a little impatient. So at some point you may have to take them out. And I have done that many a time, where at some point you just say, enough is enough. I'm sorry, your values, you may be a better fit somewhere else. So you have to
even if
take
they
those
bring in a lot of
decisions.
money, you would still do it.
Oh, absolutely. Because otherwise it rings hollow. People say, oh, that's just slogan, Saligram. You just say it for a good PR effect. So you have to put your money where your mouth is. But look, at the CEO level, a lot of times this philosophy, it has to cascade down. And
Yeah.
that's why you have to have good HR systems, good HR people who are constantly monitoring things. You're getting feedback. I make our HR people read all our reports on Glassdoor, because that's a good monitoring tool to say, what are people saying? And then we are doing exit interviews and trying to say, okay, if people are leaving, why did they leave? What did they say about us? And sooner or later, word gets around and you see the behaviors and you give people chances. You don't automatically just go and say, hey, you're a jerk, you're out. That's no good. You want to counsel them, coach them, but at some point, you just have to pull the trigger if they're not changing their behavior. So,
Yeah.
a lot of times people don't realize how they're coming across. But I have very little patience for executives who want to bring others down to propagate themselves and throw their teammates under the bus. That's for me a no-no.
Yeah, it's
You asked
interesting.
another question. What do you do as an employee if you've got a boss? Look, I think it's important to talk to your HR people. If you've got good HR people, they'll listen. Most companies, the HR people are advocates. They're meant to be not only looking at the side of the corporation, but also be advocates for employees. So use the systems to help you to get counsel, and talk to your boss. Have transparent communication. It's never easy when you have that, but I think it's important. And if it just becomes, if the company doesn't really care, then you have to ask, is this the right company for you?
Do you know how and why leadership is changing? I just put together a brand new PDF which outlines the 6 trends that are shaping leadership and what it means to be a leader, and it will also give you action items for what you should be doing for each one of these trends. If you want to grab a copy of the PDF, go to 6leadershiptrends.com. Again, that is 6leadershiptrends.com. You can either spell out the number 6 or just use the number 6 in the URL. They both take you to the same place. And now, back to the show. It's interesting. Previously, when you were talking about the 360 and the insights, I remember one time, this was like 4 or 5 years ago, I went to go give a talk to a large financial institution, and I was meeting with all their executives, and we were talking about stuff, and they said, usually at the 2-year mark is kind of the pivotal point where employees decide if they want to stay here or if they want to leave. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, why the 2-year mark? Well, what happens at the 2-year mark that makes people want to make that decision? And nobody in the room had an answer. And I thought that was really interesting, because here's a key pivotal moment during the life of an employee, and the organization had no idea what was getting some people to stay and what was getting some people to leave. So I love your focus on getting that insight, looking at the Glassdoor reviews, talking to employees. And the other thing that I found fascinating is you said exit interviews, which I think, by the way, are super important. And I'll share a story. It's my wife. The last full-time job she had at an organization, I, people could probably Google the name of the company. I won't mention it just because I don't want her to be mad at me. But I
Sure.
remember when she was doing the exit interview, the lady who was doing the exit interview for my wife. My wife was let go from the organization, and this is like 5 years ago. And the lady who was doing the exit interview was literally running a meeting. She was on a webinar trying to do the exit interview with my wife at the same time. And my wife told me this when she came home, and she's like, I am so glad I am out of that company because they do not care about anybody. They don't even want to know what happened. They don't want to know why I'm leaving and nothing. She was too busy running a meeting to even talk to me, to ask me any questions. She just wanted me to sign some paperwork, which is unfortunate because I think there's a lot that you can learn from an exit interview. So I just wanted to give you that feedback, and I'm glad you take them so
No, that's
seriously.
and I'm sorry your wife had to go through that. But I think, Jacob, it's so. Look, I think leaders need to really believe in their hearts. It has to be in their DNA
Yeah.
about people first. If you don't believe it, you can't fake it, and people will see through it. But I fundamentally believe that people are the most important asset of a company, especially in companies, consumer packaged goods, where innovation is so important. You are relying on your people, and for them to exercise their creativity, their imagination, and give all. You need to show that you care. Look, when the pandemic happened, we were one of the first to close our offices. And then even though at that time there was nothing about masks, I told our chief procurement officer, Steve, I said, get masks from Hong Kong, get millions shipped over, and we started getting them to our factories. And we pivoted from the turnaround and redefined our priorities as saying, hey, keep people safe, make sure that the factories are running so that we're making essential products for consumers. And third, keep the company financially viable and have liquidity. So I think this people first, you've got to practice it, and it has to, your leadership team. And today I'm blessed with an incredible leadership team. I brought them together. I brought a lot of people from the outside, but people who are on the inside. And I'm very fortunate to have four great women CEOs who run my business units, along with four males. And that is just, I think that diversity really helps us drive this people first philosophy.
Yeah, and you make up a good point because some people say people first, but they don't actually live it or believe it. And I think your employees can tell if you really believe that and if that's the culture of the organization or if it's just kind of, words that you stick on your website. So living it is important. I have kind of a tough question for you, and this is a question that I asked a lot of the CEOs that I've interviewed, and all the CEOs seem to be challenged by this as well. So on the one hand, everyone wants to have this culture of authenticity, of transparency, being your true self. On the other hand, there's a lot of talk about cancel culture in organizations, right? Where, be authentic, but if you say the wrong thing, people might come after you. How do you balance these two things? And has this happened to you? Have you struggled with this as an individual or inside your company of the authenticity and transparency with, the cancel culture?
Yeah, it is every company in America today, right? Regardless of whether you have 30,000 employees or 3,000, we're kind of a microcosm of America, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're global, it's the different cultures around the globe, but definitely in America. And today our country is divided, and there's lots of issues. So you have to figure out when you talk to your employees, because as they say, one person's elixir may be another person's poison. And how do you, without being too politically correct, how do you make sure that you're taking into account? because what you don't want in a company is further polarization.
Yeah, exactly.
Because as a leader, our jobs, leaders need to unite, harmonize, align, because at the end of the day, you're in the business of serving consumers rather than having politics. So you do want people to be able to express themselves, but there's also express themselves in the context of the culture you have in your company,
Yeah.
because different companies have different cultures,
Yep.
and what may be acceptable in one company may not be acceptable in another. And so I think having a little bit of EQ for the employees, because trying to understand where are the unwritten boundaries. So just because you want to be authentic, and if someone is behavior is not so great, you don't want to tell them to the face, "Hey, you're a real jerk," because that may produce a different reaction.
Yeah.
So I think it is, but you do want leaders have an obligation, a moral obligation, to allow different voices to be heard. And leaders have to intervene a bit when if someone is trying to cancel someone else out and say, hey, hold the brakes, put the brakes on, at least listen to them. You don't need to agree. And in organizations, we want employees to be teammates and comrades in arms, if you will, battling the competition, pleasing the consumer. But they don't need to be best friends, but they at least need to listen to each other. And even it's okay to agree to disagree, but
Yeah.
not listening to someone else's point of view is not acceptable, because you
Hmm.
need different voices to be heard. And this is where leaders set the stage and model behavior. And hey, do leaders elicit different opinions? So in my leadership team, I go around the room to get everyone's opinions. They're all, and I want more divergent opinions rather than everyone trying to agree with me. And then we debate it. And the fact that you're debating issues versus silencing, because I think the cancel culture is when you just silence someone, no one likes that. But I think if you can air it and reasonably listen to each other's points of view, and sometimes you may just say, hey, let's agree to disagree. But at least listening and then saying what is the best thing for the company, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, it seems like it's becoming harder and harder to create that kind of safe space, that safe environment. I mean, even just on social media, right? I know lots of people who, friends for many years, and all of a sudden they stopped talking to each other because of the political debates, because of what was happening around masks or no masks. And people just became so divided that many, many years of friendships and family members, even who don't even want to like talk to each other anymore. And so it seems like in organizations you can have that same challenge. So it's becoming even harder, I think, for leaders to create that safe space to let everybody know that everyone's opinions are welcomed and should be heard. Um, any advice on how to do that in the right way?
Yeah, well, I don't know about the right way, but I can certainly suggest some ways. To me, I'm a big believer in employee resource group, affinity groups, and because they naturally provide a safe space because of affinity. And in fact, today we had a global town hall, and I had the leaders of each of our ERGs present what they're doing. And so we had our group open, which is LGBTQ, and we had Ray, which is our women's group, and our veterans group, who talked about how they had seminars on 9/11. And so different groups, and Beacon, our Black employee group. And what the message of each one of these groups was, hey, you don't need to be LGBTQ to be part of our group. We invite you because we want you to be an ally. The same with our
Mm.
Beacon, the Black group, to say, you don't have to be Black. If you're white or brown, it's fine, join us.
Yeah.
That creating that allyship, I think in those safe spaces, now you may not be able to change everyone's mind, but if you're able to start changing a few people's mind, one day at a time, you make great progress. In my mind, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon for companies.
Yeah.
And leaders really need to strive to create unity amidst the diversity. The other thing is, one also needs to be, when we have so many affinity groups, you also have to say, hey, how does someone in the majority feel so that they don't feel left behind? And saying, okay, where do I go? So I think it is taking all these people, and this is where I think, Jacob, I spend a lot of time on, rather than talking about the divisions, how do you unite people on a common purpose, a noble purpose for the company,
Yeah.
so that the purpose is far bigger than any individual, even bigger than the CEO or the board or the shareholders? That's everlasting. And I found some success at Office Max. We talked about, hey, how do we become a company that helps small businesses? And that every employee is about enabling small businesses, because if we made small businesses grow, America grows. And that was very patriotic for our frontline employees. And that really changed the whole tenor of how they approached uh, greeting customers into stores.
Yeah.
At Newell today, we really talk about creating iconic brands and being a consumer led innovation powerhouse that is driving innovation, creating moments of joy for our consumers, peace of mind and confidence, but also being a company that's a force for good.
Hmm.
So when you create those sorts of things and you keep working at it, despite being in a turnaround, despite being in a pandemic, I think it just gets people galvanized and
Yeah.
excited and inspired. So that's how, even though COVID has been a very difficult time, adversity has been our friend. We've been able to move our company forward. And I'm really pleased to see that we're more united than divided. And I can't afford, when you're a company leader, you can't have those sorts of divisions,
Yeah.
because
No.
you need to be focused.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Um, One of the other things, I think you wrote about this on your LinkedIn page as well. You talked about the difference between shareholder value and stakeholder value. So I was hoping you can clarify, what's the difference between shareholder value and stakeholder value, and how are those things linked together?
Yeah, I think this sort of debate goes back to quite some time.
Yeah.
And so one of the famous economists wrote about, hey, the business of companies to make profit. And so that there's been a lot of debates over the last several decades. And I think more recently, there was a whole thing about stakeholder value. And I think during, the financial crisis, there was a feeling that, hey, some companies had probably become, or some institutions, too greedy. And I think this whole concept of compassionate capitalism. Now, for me, the way I look at it is, as an immigrant who came to this country with $9 in my pocket and sitting in business school, it was drilled into me that the job of a CEO is to drive shareholder value. Shareholder value is really about your investors, what have they invested, making sure they get a great return on it. And that's a very important moral responsibility for a CEO. But I don't see a debate, because I don't see shareholder value being mutually exclusive from stakeholder value. Because stakeholder value is what you do for your various constituents,
Yeah.
your employees, your consumers, your customers, your communities, your suppliers. And the whole job is to really align all those stakeholders and drive value for them, so they become enablers of driving shareholder value. How can a company drive shareholder value if you're not focused on your employees, if you're not focused on your consumers, if you're not focused on your customers? That's the triangle. If you drive those, that's when you get shareholder value. So to me, it's not a debate. It's not shareholder value versus stakeholder value. It is shareholder value and stakeholder value. And CEOs need to do both. It's like walking and chewing gum at the same time.
I love that analogy of walking and chewing gum at the same time. I know we have a couple minutes left only, so a few more questions for you. One, I'm really curious, when you think back throughout your career, is there a particular moment or moments that most shaped who you are as a leader?
Sure, I'd say I already talked about one that age 31 or so, when Beth Pritchard, my VP of Insight Control. Later on, I think she became CEO of Victoria's Secret. She had Gail Kosterman, the head of HR, do that 360 on me. I think that probably was the most pivotal in terms of really making me self aware and my deficiencies and what I had to work on. Going to Korea, that assignment at age 32, running a company, albeit small. First time I'm running a commercial business in addition to a consumer business in a country, I had never been to Korea. All I had seen was MASH. Here I am, I go, and at that time it was technically bankrupt. We had to rev up that company. Over the 4 years, sales tripled. We became very profitable, and we did some amazing things. We were named as one of the 3 best foreign managed companies in Korea. And that was for me a defining, really seminal sort of assignment. And one of the best pieces of advice I got there was from my CFO. And he said, because I was doing a 360 with them, and he said, hey, Saligram, you're from America. You only look at star performers, but you're now the president of a company. And in a company, there are people who are below average, average, and above average. You can't just focus on superstars. Your job is to think about the average people and how do you make them above average. And so that for me, as I've run businesses with a lot of people, I'm now a lot about the greater good, about really the entire populace and how do I bring out the very best in them. Rather than making them the best, how do you bring out the best in them? Because that is what really gives you that movement forward. I think that's been great advice and has shaped me as a leader.
Well, now I have to ask you about any advice on how to bring the best out of people. What have you learned works well?
I think humility is very important and suppressing your ego. And because I think it is really because so many times you have your ego gets bruised.
Yeah.
You have reactions. Instead, if you're humble and you're always saying what's best for your brand, what's best for the company, what's best for all of the people, what's the best decision, and you're also able to manage the short term and the long term because you cannot have a long term without a short term. But if you just butcher the short term, you will not have a long term. So it's that balance. But I think it's very important and over communicate and be transparent, be truthful. Don't treat employees like babies. Make employees part of the solution and don't treat them that they're the problem. So, and then I always say, use the word we. So don't say I, we, because it's you can never do anything by yourself. And I learned that in Korea. When you don't speak the language and you're reliant on all your people to accomplish the mission, you have so much of a greater appreciation for what people do. So those would be some of the things that I would say really make yourself that servant leader, that you're in service of your people. You're not the big boss.
Yeah.
I always joke, I'm only big in width and breadth, but not because I'm the big boss. I'm really here to serve you.
I love it. All right, and last question for you before we wrap up. I think at the very beginning you mentioned that your wife and daughters, they help keep your ego in check. So I wanted to get your perspectives on ego and how do they keep your ego in check, or how do you keep your ego in check, and why is this such an important thing for leaders to do?
Yeah, I'm really blessed. Look, I grew up with 5 aunts. One of those aunts, Shanti, helped me come to America, and she took out a loan. My mother's been a tremendous force. And later on in life, it's been my wife. I've been happily married for 37 years, and I have two
Wow.
daughters, 33 and 31. They're the light of my life. They really they say, Dad, I'll tell you, they came to visit me in my office at Ritchie Brothers in Vancouver, and we were on the elevator. And I had sort of learned early on at Burnett loose lips sink ships. And so I don't speak in elevators. So there were a couple of employees and I smiled at them, but I didn't say anything. After we got down, my daughters really reproached me. They said, Dad, why didn't you say anything to them? You're the CEO. And I said, yeah, but they said, no, Dad. You have to really learn, make small talk, ask them how their day was. You need to be approachable. So they're constantly giving me advice. And that's how I learned to get, I really understand the millennials, Gen Z a lot because my daughters are giving me a lot of constructive feedback. And then that helps me because look, they're fearless with their dad and they put the mirror up to me, and so does my wife. My wife is very accomplished. She was number one from nursery to PhD, Nalini. She runs a nonprofit, incredibly smart. So these three women are very feisty, and they will not take. They say, Dad, you got to be modest. You got to be caring. You got to. So when George Floyd happened, it was my younger daughter who said, Dad, are you going to talk to your employees? And I started thinking about it and wrote this letter that night called Embracing Your Humanity. Yeah. And she helped me edit it, as did my VP of Communications. And so they're always calling on my conscience. And I think that ego thing is important because, look, if you become an emperor without clothes and you start thinking you're omnipotent, you need to be omnipresent, not omnipotent, because that's when the more approachable you are to employees, because the lower you go, you'll get more truth.
Yeah.
And so I think that ego, conquering that is very important.
I love it. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up. Where can people go to learn more about you and your company? I know you're on LinkedIn. You've written a couple articles on there, but anything that you want to mention for people to check out, and you can even hold up those new pens. Maybe people want to grab one of the new pens.
Well, I'm going to be a shameless corporate shill. I love this pen. This is Sharpie S Gel. The team launched it. Laurel Hurd, my CEO of writing, and her team launched this year, and it's just been such an extraordinary success. It's almost becoming a $50 million brand. It's gained huge market share.
Wow.
It writes so beautifully. We had a skater who someone wrote and said, this pen writes like this beautiful skater skates. It flows. So look at Newell Brands' website, Google in Newell Brands, and you'll see our great iconic brands. I hope you use them. We've got Rubbermaid Brilliance, one of my favorite brands. Calphalon, I cook with it. Love that. The Calphalon cutlery, the knives are tremendous. The ball jars, my team told me about a great thing that I think Millward Brown said it's one of the 4 greatest iconic American brands in the same way Apple is. And I was astonished. And so that is such a great, it's, I think, more than 100-year-old brand.
Yeah.
Used for not only canning, but storing all sorts of stuff. And during the pandemic, people used it for cocktails. Restaurants used it for cocktails. So love our brands. I hope you love them too.
I love the way you light up when you talk about your products and your brands. So people who are watching the video will be able to see how excited you get when you're talking about that stuff, which I love.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I'm sure people will get a lot of valuable insights and information from this. And thank you everyone for tuning in to this week's episode of The Future of Work. Make sure to connect with Ravi and check out Newell Brands and some of their cool products. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again for tuning into the show, and don't forget to go to 6leadershiptrends.com to grab a copy of my brand new PDF, which is going to walk you through the 6 trends that are shaping leadership and what it means to be a leader, and it will also give you action items for what you should be doing for each one of these 6 trends to adapt and evolve so that you can be a better leader in the future of work. Again, that is 6leadershiptrends.com. You can either spell out the number 6 in the URL, or just use the number 6 in the URL. They will both take you to the same place. Thanks again for tuning in.